This one's going to be a little bit, I'm adding a little bit of stuff on great apes. Just because I mean, it may be of interest in terms of zoos, so it's not just the carnivores. But you'll see the sort of similarities that we have with regards to some of these problems. Okay, sodium chloride, you all know it as salt. All right, it's the most important extracellular electrolyte in the body. Intracellular electrolyte will be potassium, so we have potassium inside the cells, and we have sodium outside the cells, mainly in the blood. And that's why blood has got a sort of salty taste, because of the amount of sodium that you have in the blood. I'm going to just highlight all of those for the moment. All right, so critical role obviously in regulation of the extracellular fluid volume, critical for plasma, homeostasis, very, very important. I don't know if you have like marathon runners. One of our scientists, Tim Noakes, most famous in South Africa for having figured out what causes a lot of these ultra-distance marathon runners to die. And one of the big problems with them is that they overdrink on water, and ended up the sodium concentration in the brain gets diluted to such an extent by the overhydration that they end up, going into a coma at the end of the race. And it's funny, the longer you take to run, the more opportunity you have to drink. So the slower performers in a race were at much greater risk of doing that. And if the temperature is predicted to be pretty warm, the amount of sodium that you actually lose in sweat is minimal. So the people are not drinking a sort of mixed electrolyte with additional sodium in it. They're just drinking, over drinking on water. Anyway, so in humans it's pretty important. I mean, obviously important in that sort of situation. It's controlled by a number of different hormone systems in the body, and it's very interesting that cats, for example, don't have an actual sodium appetite. So you can deplete a cat, and probably true for all of our cat species, you can deplete them of sodium by feeding them a low sodium diet, and then you can place two bowls in front of them, one with a high salt content and one with no salt in it at all, and they still will not choose between them. They will still eat them equally. They don't have a salt appetite. And as I've explained to you before, that's probably because they just never have to. They don't have a high salt or low salt mouse. Versus many other animals that you will actually see going, lemurs, for example, you'll see them in Madagascar. They will go and sit in those brackish water edges, and they will actually eat mud and the edge where there's a fairly high salt content. They're replacing the actual salt in their diet. So there are many, many species, including humans, that will actually develop a salt craving. And very often in herbivores, one of the only supplements that we will provide in many of these game reserves and nature reserves where you've got herbivores, where there's a little bit of restriction in terms of movement and so on, is to provide them with a salt block. And it's critically important. That little bit of salt that they get actually improves their performance, their food intake, and therefore their reproductive health and so on. So it's fairly critical, and that's probably the thing that we will supplement them with before anything else. Now, the complex control of, in humans, a lot of this work has been done. Salt plays a very important role in the body to maintain blood pressure. Now, obviously, that's developed quite a bad sort of reputation in terms of causing hypertension or high blood pressure. But I think it's quite a lot more complex than simply overeating on salt, and that's what I'm going to try and explain to you today. Because I think people then realize or think that, high salt diet equals heart disease. So what do they do with the great apes when they are feeding them, whatever diet? They absolutely do not give them any salt whatsoever, right, in their diet. And because great apes were known to have major problems with heart disease. And I actually think this makes the problem 10 times worse, and probably maybe one of the underlying causes. So just to explain here, if you haven't done sort of some of this renal physiology before, if if somebody chops your arm off and you start bleeding, your dramatic drop in blood pressure, right, and the body immediately will kick into action a whole system in your kidneys called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. It produces renin. Renin produces angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 in the lungs. That causes massive vasoconstriction to try and push up your blood pressure. And angiotensin 2 then causes aldosterone to be released from your adrenal gland, from the adrenal medulla. And aldosterone will then reabsorb all the sodium from your kidney, from your urine as much as possible. And that will then draw the fluid into the actual, with the sodium retained in the blood vessels. You'll draw extra fluid into the blood vessels, which will push your blood pressure up. So this whole system is designed to try and maintain blood pressure. And obviously that is, I always say this is to the students, that this is a kind of emergency hormone system. So if you, for example, have gone for a week without eating or without taking any sodium in for whatever reason, because your diet couldn't allow it, you're going to get a drop in total body sodium, and your body is going to say, okay, let's keep everything that we possibly can from the urine. We're not going to waste any sodium in the urine. We're going to keep it all back in order to maintain a blood pressure. Otherwise, your blood pressure is going to drop too low. The same would happen if you had a sudden drop in blood pressure. Okay, you're going to get aldosterone produced, but it's not a hormone system that needs to be functioning 24/7. All right, you don't want this system on the go all the time. It's only going to happen when you have those unique situations where there's either a drop in total body sodium or a drop in blood pressure. Okay, I think that it's a complex system which they're kind of understanding. I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but just to show you here, so this is the actual aldosterone, which is the end product, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid that's produced by the adrenal medulla. So in the adrenal cortex, you have things like adrenaline being produced. Okay, so the adrenal gland itself doesn't just produce adrenaline; it also produces cortisol. And then in the medulla part, which is the other cells in the adrenal gland, you get this hormone called aldosterone being produced. So as I said, its main function is the reabsorption of sodium, and it's regulated by angiotensin 2, as well as the potassium level, as well as ACTH from the brain. All right, but yeah, you can see over this graph over here, if you have the aldosterone concentration, all right, if you have initial, this is where the sodium requirement, when you give a lot of sodium, aldosterone levels will go right down. Then when you deplete the sodium, up goes both plasma and urine aldosterone level, and then when you replete them, basically down it goes again. So that's the normal state. You should be producing very little aldosterone in the body at any given time, unless you have a particular emergency situation. Now, if you don't, and you end up with aldosterone being produced all the time, right, you end up with a real problem. Okay, it's been implicated in metabolic syndrome, which is the initial phase of type 2 diabetes. You get, and it's a very fibrotic hormone. In other words, it causes fibrosis. Fibrosis is like scarring that occurs in particularly the kidneys, and then also secondarily, in the heart. So you can get damage to the heart muscle. It's also pro-inflammatory. It increases oxidative stress. It increases hypertension. You get dyslipidemia. Right. So this has been fairly well studied now. We know that aldosterone, when it hangs around, when it's in situations for too long, it actually can cause quite severe damage. This is just another study where low-salt diets increase insulin resistance. Again, so they're creating a real problem. Insulin resistance is a fairly interesting situation in humans, because it actually is something humans have evolved in order to be able to allow us to be able to store fat. So when you suddenly found a tree with a whole bunch of fruit and you ate a lot of fruit, okay, high sugar, high carbohydrate intake, you're going to, for that month that fruit is available, you're going to develop some degree of insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is mainly to try and prevent, basically the cells in your body are saying, thank you very much, I've got enough energy reserves now, please don't give me any more, please send this to the fat reserves and go and store it as fat. So it has a beneficial effect. so that you can store it as fat, so that when that tree has stopped fruiting and you've got nothing else to eat for the next month, you'll be able to then mobilize the fat that you've got and use your fat reserves. Now, exactly like aldosterone, you don't want to have that situation 24/7, all year round, 365 days a year. So we as humans cycle, or should be cycling, between some degree of insulin resistance. We're putting on fat during the winter or whenever, and then we would go through periods of fasting again for longer periods of time when we don't have food available or carbohydrates available, and then we will become insulin sensitive again. And then that fluctuation, and part of I think our modern problem that we have is just that we eat the same diet and we have so much carbohydrate available 365 days a year. We don't do that actual seasonal cycling the way that we sort of have been designed to do, or the way we've evolved to do. So anyway, but even low salt diet has causes increase in insulin resistance. I mean, that may be a case in some sort of situations. Most of us are worried about a very high salt intake, but what I try and show you in this presentation too, that actually a low salt intake is probably far worse than overdoing it on the salt. Okay, and I'll show you some of the data that's been coming out recently in that regard. This just to show on a low salt diet and a high salt diet the differences in terms of aldosterone production, and far more aldosterone being produced. Serum aldosterone 45 versus on a high salt diet only 11.2. Okay, I'll move on from here. And then just to show you here, this is the mineralocorticoid activation, and it causes a decrease in insulin receptors. IRS and IRS 1 and 2 and GLUT2 and 4, those are transporters of glucose in the cells. You get a decrease in their ability to, and basically you get insulin resistance as well. So it's not the only cause of insulin resistance, but it's also plays a role there. And then also aldosterone and parathyroid hormone, a precarious couple for cardiovascular disease. So this is now where you have a combination. Parathyroid hormone, remember, you're going to get very high levels of parathyroid hormone when your calcium intake is not high enough. All right, so if your calcium and salt intake are not adequate, all right, you've got these two, parathyroid and aldosterone, produced in large amounts, and that can then potentially cause heart disease, or real problems with the heart. This is quite a nice graph that shows so yeah, they're measuring the urinary sodium and potassium excretion and the risk of cardiovascular events. So in humans, we obviously know what a cardiovascular event is, basically a heart attack. Any sort of cardiovascular, that's probably the most common one. And this is looking at the sodium excretion, so that's roughly be equivalent to the sodium intake per day. Now, most people on a Western diet, most Western diets would be consuming somewhere between 3 and 5 grams of salt per day. So roughly about a teaspoon of salt, all right, 5 grams. And if you look at that, then 5 grams shows you that you have the lowest incidence of a cardiovascular event. All right, so that actually is probably the ideal range of salt intake. Okay, and yet, if you look at many of the recommendations, they'll tell you you need to cut down to about 1.5 or 2 grams of salt per day. If you look at 2 grams over there, you've got the equivalent chance of having a cardiovascular event as if you were taking 10 grams of salt. Okay, and it makes sense in the sense that you basically, if you're going to have anything under probably about 4 grams of salt per day, you're going to start activating that whole renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system in the body. So you're going to end up with chronic hyperaldosteronism. So this whole recommendation, I think, is gradually changing over a period of time, certainly in humans. But you'll see that the potential is there for the same problems that we have in our other species. So the effects of dietary sodium chloride intake on renal function and blood pressure in cats with normal and reduced renal function. So I just wanted to show you, I think I highlight something here. Yeah, this was the article. So yeah, oh no, that's not the same article. No, problems can't going back. All right, so there they, again, I'll link this back to renal function in cats because, again, if you're not providing sufficient salt in the diet, you're going to activate that whole renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And then, as I said, aldosterone is a pro-fibrotic hormone. It causes fibrosis, and particularly fibrosis in the kidney, which is one of the main lesions that we see in cats with renal failure. So here, this is a review of long-term effects of low sodium diet versus a high sodium diet on blood pressure, renin, aldosterone, catecholamines, and cholesterol and triglycerides. So, and yeah, I'm just going to read that because it's too small. Yes, so the implications for practice and research: the low sodium diet in normotensive, so people with normal blood pressure, and this was in Caucasians, showed less than a 1% decrease in systolic blood pressure and a 3.5% decrease in hypertensive Caucasians. Now, 3.5%. If you've got a blood pressure that's sitting at about 160 over 100 or whatever, okay, you're hypertensive. A 3% reduction by simply limiting your sodium intake is not very much at all. All right, and so it's showing that limiting sodium intake is actually not really going to help you very much if you're suffering from hypertension or high blood pressure. And then sodium reduction diets resulted in significant increase in lipids, plasma cholesterol and triglycerides, and hormones, renin, aldosterone, and catecholamines, okay, all of which are going to have a negative effect on cardiovascular function. So actually, this recommendation of a low-sol diet for hypertension or high blood pressure is really not a great idea at all. What I would rather do than limiting your sodium chloride intake is push up your potassium intake, okay, and if you have hypertension, high blood pressure, is push up your potassium intake. There are many, many foods that contain, and food-based potassium is by far better than supplementation. So foods that contain a lot of potassium would be much, much better to try and get your blood pressure down than to try and do the opposite and try and increase or decrease some sodium intake. Okay, yeah. So just wanted to show you, cheetahs get this disease called glomerulosclerosis. Very, very common. It is a form of damage to the kidney. It doesn't normally cause major renal failure, or it develops over a lifetime in these animals. And I'm going to discuss a bit more on renal disease in a moment. Okay, just show you the incidence of it. That's what it is. The captive diet, as I said, one of the major things is that they exsanguinate the carcasses before they feed them. So they're taking all the blood out of those carcasses. Very often, I mean, whether it's horses or whether it's cattle, and they slaughtered, they hung, all the blood is removed from the carcass in the traditional way in which they are slaughtered. And that for them is their major salt reserve that's being removed and then not fed to them. The blood-rich organs, like the spleen and so on, which are often engorged with blood, the liver also contains a fair amount of blood reserve, are often not fed to them. So the amount of sodium that they have access to is actually quite a lot lower. I'm not going to show you that one. So we did a pilot study just on some captive cheetahs, and this was again done at Africat. I just want to pop these all up. So here, out of 28 captive cheetahs, I measured 18 of the 28 captive cheetahs had no detectable sodium in their urine. So we have a test that's quite sensitive. It'll measure anything that's below sort of 10 millimoles per liter. Okay, but basically all those results came, or 64% of them, almost 2/3 of them came back and said, well, there's no detectable sodium in the urine. Now, that's not a very good homeostatic position to be in. You always want to be excreting a little bit of extra sodium in there. So what it tells us is that basically those cheetahs are absorbing every last drop of sodium that they can. And that means that they probably are deficient. If you go and measure just the blood sodium levels, again, like many, many other things, it's not going to tell you what is really happening in terms of the animal's total body reserve of sodium, because you can't really, like those marathon runners, you can't fiddle with the blood sodium level too much, otherwise you're going to end up in a coma. If it goes too low and if it goes too high, it's going to cause major hypertension and you're going to burst a blood vessel or something. So that is very, very finely regulated, and measuring blood sodium levels is not going to tell you an awful lot. So measuring the urine concentration, you get an idea of what the intake is and how much you have available to basically get rid of or to waste. Right. When you don't have anything to waste, it means that you're probably sitting on the side of too little. Now, unfortunately, in this study too, we tried to also measure urine aldosterone, although it's not a established test in cheetah urine. And there we found some cheetahs that had very, very high aldosterone levels, but we didn't see a clear correlation between the sodium levels and the aldosterone levels. Okay, so I still need to find a better way of actually measuring aldosterone in these older cheetahs, but some of them had really, really high concentrations. I don't know if you know anything about great ape heart disease, big issue around, in zoos around the world. In some institutions, chimpanzees, 77% of mortalities in chimpanzees are due to heart disease. Much lower levels in the gorillas, and then probably lowest in the orangutans. Similar levels in the bonobos as to the gorillas. All right, but we've all seen cases like this that develop, and the heart disease that they develop is a bit different to what we have as humans. They don't get heart attacks per se. They get mainly a damage to the heart muscle itself. So it's a cardiomyopathy that develops, and it's not due to a taurine deficiency or anything else. And there actually, there's a whole group in North America that the Great Ape Heart Group, or whatever they call it, project, yeah, something like that. But and they've been studying this problem for quite a long time. I don't think they've actually really dug into the underlying cause. Most of them are actually interested in monitoring animals, putting pacemakers and, just recording the heart rates and everything of these animals to try and detect the problem as early as possible. Again, I feel it's a little bit like doing it the wrong way around and try and figure out exactly what's causing the problem rather than actually trying to solve the problem once you already have got the heart disease. A lot of people feel that it's related to stress again. Okay, the stress hypothesis keeps coming back again. People think that, again, that stress of any nature is actually harmful to people or to animals. And so that, I think, is passed on straight on to these animals. But I don't think that they necessarily, whilst I'm not saying that stress doesn't play a role at all, if you increase cortisol levels, you're going to increase insulin resistance, you're going to cause some changes. But I don't think that it's a primary cause of the problem. Okay, so a very common issue. This is what you kind of see, is this necrosis in the actual fibrosis in the pupillary muscles, which are the ones that kind of hold on to the valves. Typically on the post-mortem. These animals die acutely due to a sudden arrhythmia. So they are you often walk in the morning and you find them dead. And they've died fairly quickly just because of a sudden arrhythmia, which results in reduced blood flow to the brain from the heart. And so they die. There's sometimes mild or moderate arteriosclerosis, but we don't nearly see enough arteriosclerosis like we do in humans, where you get narrowing of the arteries to such an extent that they actually reduce blood flow to the actual muscles of the heart. This is one of our chimpanzees that died, and that's what you see, the severe cyanosis. Okay, this animal was absolutely fine the one day, and the next day was just dead in the enclosure found in the morning, and mucous membranes look like that. Just to show that, that previous slide was just to show some of the cholesterol levels. Their cholesterol levels are actually higher than normal, so you have high triglycerides. That, many of the great apes that we test end up with that kind of high cholesterol, high triglycerides in their blood. Okay, fairly normal thing, but they don't have the arteriosclerosis, the narrowing of the arteries as we do. So this is a typical diet for many of these. They should contain a lot more in the way of leafy vegetables rather than these high carbohydrates diets. A lot of fruit in there, which they would really in the wild have very little access to. And if they did, it would be highly seasonal. And if you watched any primates in the wild eating fruit, they almost always eat the green fruit before it's even had any chance to ripen. So the sugar content of those diets are fairly low. The fat intake is fairly low, protein intake is often very low, fiber content of the diet, because they're not eating a lot of leafy greens, which they would normally have in the wild, where they're eating a lot more leaves and so on of trees and stuff, would be very low, and the mineral content low. Vitamin content can be sometimes fairly high because of the fruit intake. All right, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but the relationship between insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease is there, that I'm not going to discuss. But what is quite interesting here, just in terms of, this was a study that was really interesting. They were quite baffled by these gorillas in the forest that were eating decaying wood and couldn't figure out why. And it appeared to be a priority kind of a prized food item. It's a rotten wood, okay? And until they did an analysis of the actual wood itself, and found that this was providing up to 95% of their sodium requirements. All right, so it appeared that that's specifically what they were targeting. They were looking to try and you can imagine this is a fairly high rainfall area. Again, you've got this kind of sodium depletion out of the soil. There's not a lot of salt around, and this is a fairly important salt source for them. Another example is this study, mineral content as a basis for food selection by western lowland gorillas in the forest clearings. I think there's a picture here. Oh, yes, yeah. So here they sit in these kind of swamp-like conditions, and then they start selecting, specific plants. They sit there eating these plants. And when they looked at, okay, what are the mineral content of these plants, they found that these animals were also selecting specifically for sodium-rich plants. So again, sort of evidence from the wild that these animals really do have a salt appetite and that they are definitely going for the sodium. But in captivity, we really don't actually, as I said, I've never seen many gorilla diets that add salt to the diet. And because of this fear of heart disease, they stay away from salt even more. So yeah, they say how it stems from whatever the plant name, which was the most actively searched for species, had the highest mineral content among the clearing foods and was characterized by the highest amount of sodium and calcium for all items tested. The second most actively searched for species was also characterized by moderately high sodium content. This was just then also a study on the impact of dietary starch on Neobacterium coli, which is a protozoal infection we see particularly in African gorillas and chimpanzees. And they found here that the numbers of the choliprophysites were higher during a high starch diet compared to a low starch diet. So this combination of high carbohydrate and low salt seems to be a real problem with these, both from many things. So my conclusion at the moment, sodium is an important component of the diet, obviously. Sodium depletion may be a cause of chronic renin-angiotensin-aldosterone activation, which contributes towards cardiac and renal disease in these species. Okay. The insulin resistance may also play a role in the activation of that whole system as well, and the two combined. So the research needs to be to understand the role of sodium depletion and its role in chronic disease in captivity, and then basically determine the sodium requirements of those species as well. One of the studies that I wanted to do we never got around to actually doing it, was to test whether, just how much sodium these animals, if you deplete them of sodium intake, and then offer them some peanuts with salt and without salt, just to see whether they specifically I'm almost certain they do have a salt preference. And at what point can you push them, with salt intake before they actually start, rejecting it?